Liberty. This chapter is called Securing the Republic, and it covers decades straddling the turn of the 19th century. So as you can probably hear, my voice is not quite with me this week, so I'll do my best to get through this show for you. So we're going to be covering what's happening since the founding of the nation, the technical decision to start this new nation. So they have a constitution in place following the end of the Articles of Confederation. They have this new constitution to move forward with. And so this is sort of them dealing with the fact that they have these rules that they've set out and trying to figure out who these rules apply to. One thing that we should take note of about halfway through the course is check back in on these kind of big questions about studying history. So, does doing questionable things make your historical legacy null? Meaning, if you participate in something that is later on or at the time deemed morally compromised, does that mean that everything that you've done is then sent by the wayside? Who should we remember? Whose information are we getting? Who are we able to remember, first of all? And then within that, who should get the most time spent on their legacy? Who should get the most attention? What do we deem as a society as important to remember? As we've discussed several times, there's been a change in the past few decades where the lives of more regular people are starting to be recognized, and the larger patterns that affected most of the society are being studied. And that doesn't mean that we're not still studying the people who are at the top. And another question that often will come up is, can we ignore the good things about people if they're overwhelmingly bad? Do the good things matter? Does it necessarily matter that Hitler liked dogs? People always like to talk about that. It may not matter in that case that he liked animals based on his treatment of other human beings. So are we supposed to mention these things? Are we not supposed to mention them? I would say, there are all sorts of different opinions about this. If you think that it matters to balance out a person, to give some sort of information, as we said before, likely most people are somewhere in the middle of the spectrum between good and bad. So by acknowledging that there are both good and bad things about everybody, that seems fair, but so long as it's not necessarily one for one in the cases where clearly their actions were overwhelmingly detrimental to people. Another question that kind of goes with all of this: how do we deal with the fact that humans are complicated? We typically like to have a neat and tidy story about how somebody did the right thing or about how somebody was the monster. We rarely get that, and most people are extremely complicated. The people who founded the United States were complicated people. Many of them owned slaves, but were interested in expanding freedom. We've talked about the hypocrisy of this ultimate quest for freedom and liberty while still oppressing other people. Well, another thing that has probably come up for you this semester and will likely keep coming up for you is, when can we apply judgment to a situation, and do we ever apply judgment to a historical situation? What we can do is gather as much information about that time period as we can. We can try to understand what ideas were floating around, what scientific or pseudoscientific ideas were floating around, why people were acting en masse, the way that they were acting. One way that we could temper this is, were there people who did know that something was wrong? For instance, there were abolitionists. There were people who were looking to end slavery. This means that there were people who understood that the process and the institution itself was not a humanitarian prospect. This meant it should end. And there were many people who knew this at this point. So applying judgment to those who continued to work within the institution, you still want to be somewhat careful in attempting to understand the entire situation, understanding the level of education people were given, and by also looking at the history leading up to things and why they may still be continuing to use these sorts of tools to promote their economic success. This is not to say that most of them weren't aware that it was morally questionable, at the very least, to hold people in bondage. You see Thomas Jefferson's writings where he goes back and forth talking about how he has these complicated feelings about the entire institution and that he thought it would die out, but he's still a part of it. People had complicated ideas about slavery in particular and about many other things, including women's rights, Native American rights, eventually Asian American rights. So this question of can we ever apply judgment, basically gather as much information as you can, and then you can come closer to understanding the available mindsets of the time. So these are questions that are going to keep coming up probably anytime you're interested in reading about an historical event or historical person. You should have these sorts of questions, larger philosophical questions, in mind. Moving on to the information for today's slideshow, now that we've sort of reminded you of things to think about, we're going to be starting with what's called the Age of Passion. And it's called this because there was a pretty fierce battle within political parties. This may sound familiar to you. We may very well be revisiting a second age of passion, if you will. Of course, there have been many instances throughout even just the United States history where there were extreme battles between political parties and political actors. But this is one that is still notable, historically speaking. So in 1789, the first president, George Washington, under this new constitution, also begins in this new capital with Washington, D.C. And the buildings in the capital participated in slave labor economics. Their construction at times relied upon slave labor to build the new capital of this new society that is attempting to be based on freedom. The very visuals for the center of the nation relied upon depriving people of their basic freedoms. The electoral system at this point, as we discussed before, the votes would count towards not only the president but also the vice president. So the system that we're used to today is that someone running for president would pick someone to run as their vice president with them. At this point, the vice president was chosen by having the second most votes. So you could have a president and a vice president coming from different parties. Hamilton was an extremely important thinker at this point, politically speaking. Without the singing, we get the singing in the 2010s, which is, of course, very fun. But at this point, what we're thinking and talking about are the steps that he believed would solidify the nation and help it to move forward without necessarily falling backwards or needing to rely on another country to prop them up economically. So if they were going to move up in the world, if they were going to live up to this expectation that they all had for this new nation, some of the things that they needed were creditworthiness. They were hoping that people would purchase bonds to create a loan to the government, essentially. They could cash them out eventually, but they did need some funding up front. He also believed that the national debt should be collected from the states and replaced with interest bonds to solidify wealthy investors' interest in propping up the government. So he thought that the states should not have their own individual debts as they would have as a colony, and that if they were going to be this united nation, that they needed to combine their debt as a national debt. The Bank of the United States, they wanted a national financial institution. This would be a private institution that held public funds, issued currency, and made loans as appropriate. They wanted one central financial spot to not only keep their money, but to make their money and to borrow money from. Hamilton also noted that it would be important to raise revenue. So this would be taxing people based on their income and based on trade a lot of the time. We'll talk about the whiskey tax coming up. But the taxing of the citizens of the nation was meant to benefit the citizens of the nation as a whole, because there would be a pool of money that they could then use to improve different parts in the nation that needed the financial assistance. The fifth step that he talked about was imposing tariffs on foreign goods in order, excuse me, I'm sorry. He wanted to impose tariffs to encourage home manufacturing. Essentially, he wanted domestic production of things rather than purchasing things from other countries and importing them. So by making the foreign goods more expensive, that would encourage people to make these goods within the United States. It should be noted he was also a fan of creating a national army. It says creating a national army on here. I apologize for that. But he was not looking to put them in a crate or a cage. He was looking to solidify them as a standing force. Jefferson and Madison are on the other side of things. So we have the Federalists, and then we have the Anti-Federalists here. So these are the political divides that we talked about last week that continue. Jefferson and Madison were more interested in this agrarian lifestyle. They were interested in keeping things more simple, more agrarian, so growing things. They were looking to create a nation that would be built upon hard work and continue the plantation lifestyle that had been moving throughout the last century. And they were also interested in maintaining an isolationist standpoint with a small government in order to keep things a little bit simpler. So if you were governing on more of a regional scale, you were less likely to be missing the people in your direct in your direct reach. If you had to consider everybody in the United States, you were going to be missing some people with some laws, and you would be benefiting people in one area. It's sort of what happens now. The United States is relatively large, and if you're making a law that makes sense in Texas, it may not make sense in California, or it may not make sense in Rhode Island, it may not make sense in Massachusetts. We've dealt with this in different ways over the years, but it was already a question at the very beginning. The whiskey tax that we mentioned as one of Hamilton's points, taxing people, it was not good for farmers in general. The grains were easy to carry to the market in liquid form, in whiskey or alcohol, and alcohol is a popular product. Carrying the actual grains with them instead of making it into whiskey, the grains weren't taxed, the whiskey was, angered a lot of farmers, and eventually you see rebellions against the whiskey tax and similar taxes. And it's at this point where you see a continuation of a north and south divide. What happens at this point is that the north pushes further into this manufacturing site, where the south is attempting to remain an agrarian state. So they're attempting to keep working the land and dig deeper into that, even into what's called the Deep South. And the North was turning towards building some factories, and we'll talk more about those next week. But you do start to see manufacturing pop up in a viable way in the North at this point. The Whiskey Rebellion that we promised to talk about took place in 1794 in western Pennsylvania. This was what many would refer to as the regular people. So these were the common people living their lives, not part of this 1% or less than 1% who was ruling the nation and making the laws. They were regular people like all of us, who were attempting to block the whiskey tax because it was harmful to them. And they were being taxed on something that people liked. We know that continues to be an issue with what's called sin taxes at this point, oftentimes put on cigarettes, or if marijuana is legal in a particular state for recreational purposes, there's a high tax put on it. What happened was George Washington, sent 13,000 militiamen as a show of force to establish dominance, and he actually led them for part of it. He was hoping to quash this rebellion before it really became the sort of rebellions that they'd seen before, where people were losing their lives or entire cities were being burnt down. And with this, no battle ended up coming to fruition, because the show of force with the 13,000 militiamen, imagine that, was enough to calm it down. And this was important for the nation as a whole, because it suggested that the nation was actually able to control its citizens within state borders. So this is the federal government coming from Washington, D.C., and going into a particular state, Pennsylvania, and using a show of force to make sure that they remained in line with the federal government. So this is federal over state, which we talked about last week as being the larger umbrella over all the different states, and the federal law superseding the state law. The major party names at this point, this often is changing and in flux, and we'll have to keep talking about this for the rest of the semester. But you have the Federalists versus the Republicans. So the Republicans were sort of the anti-Federalists from before that we were talking about. The Federalists, to provide you a little summary, had close ties with Britain and favored Hamilton's tactics. So those 5 steps that we talked about before. They were often Northerners. They were often quite wealthy, and they were charged as being elitist and out of touch with the common people within the country. One of the concepts that they held was that deference to authority was important. If you were going against the man, as we call it, you were potentially threatening the stability of the nation. And to go with that, they often felt that democracy and freedom was dangerous in the hands of the regular people. So this is that concern for the mob rule, or concern that there would be a mass rebellion of people. And this is the basis for the Electoral College that we talked about last week, curbing the ability of the mass population to decide, to have a larger say in the political realm and in the legal realm. Republicans, in contrast to the Federalists, had more faith in democracy and the people. They felt that people knew what was right for them, and that if they were voting in a particular way, that meant that was reflecting the actual will of the people, not a thought-out will of the people above them in the hands of the elitists in the Federalist Party. They also managed to express support for France in the English and French battles, as opposed to the Federalists supporting England or Britain. And the French were actually waging their own revolution at this point. I'm sure you're aware of the French Revolution. Probably many of you have seen Les Mis, based on the French Revolution, and inspired by the American Revolution. And part of what goes along with this is that there was this idea that it was better to be wild and free than calm and dominated. So rather than having a calm, orderly society that was as such because of this domination, because of George Washington and 13,000 militiamen riding in, that it would be better to have these rebellions once in a while. And we went over that quote last week, where the blood of patriots and tyrants water the earth, essentially. This goes along with that sort of idea that it would be better to have more freedoms and potentially have some dangers that come along with that. The 1792 election had gone to Washington, and in his farewell address, he famously called for unity and warned against divided and international politics. So his farewell address is quite famous. I will post it on the assignments tab for you if you're interested. It's one of the classic documents that's not included in your Voices of Freedom book in this edition. It was included in the previous one. Excuse me. But the major point of it was that he was calling for the nation to come together and find some levels of compromise, for he feared that it would be torn apart. This is a common theme that you'll see coming through pretty much every decade throughout United States history, but this was a particularly important one because it was the first transfer of power from one leader to the next. So this was a really important point where they figured out if this new system that they had set up for this new nation was going to work or not. The peaceful transfer of power is one of the most important points in electing a new leader. Otherwise, you would have dictators as other countries do, or you may end up with a similar situation to a monarchy. So in the 1796 election, you have John Adams and Thomas Pinckney as the Federalists, and you have Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr as the Republicans. John Adams won, as we know, second president of the United States, and Thomas Jefferson was vice president based on the votes. There continued to be unrest. Again, you could always find some of this. Any given decade, you're going to have a number of rebellions, you're going to have political scandals. So these decades following the official creation of the nation are no different. In Fry's Rebellion in 1799, this was based on tax assessments to help fund the military in Pennsylvania. The men who were arrested were released from prison by a crowd of protesters. So they broke in, freed these people, and there were no weapons used in this prison break, but the Federal Army was sent to the uprising, and Fry, the leader of the rebellion, was arrested for treason. And this is another issue where you see this show of force to try to control what's happening in a particular state. So the federal government, again, sending out troops to tamp down a rebellion in Pennsylvania. It just happens to be Pennsylvania again. Although Fries was arrested for treason, he was pardoned the next year. But what did happen was that this area was turned against the Federalists. So they pushed harder into the agrarian lifestyle, into the will of the common people, and sort of this anti-government stance. So you can see things going back and forth based on the historical events that happened in a particular area and how it was handled. In 1798, you have the Alien and Sedition Acts put into place. The Alien Act, not talking about E.T. over here, maintained that the ability to deport anybody who is deemed dangerous was at the discretion of the government. So if people were starting a rebellion, for example, and they were considered dangerous, they could then be deported and no longer allowed to live within the United States and no longer a U.S. citizen. The Sedition Act meant that there could be no criticism of the government, and this led to battles for the right for free speech and larger discussions about what that meant. They'd already gone through the Zinger trial that we talked about a couple weeks ago, where it was stated that if your statement was true, then you were allowed to print it. At this point, they're suggesting that there could be no or limited criticism of the government. And people were extremely concerned about what this meant. And one of the reasons that this was put into place was that political writings would oftentimes excite people to the point that they would join in with protest groups or mobs or rebellions, this sort of thing. So by allowing these pamphlets to go out unchecked that were critical of the government, they thought more and more people would rebel and the nation would eventually crumble. The election of 1800 is one of the first that looks like an election that we're more familiar with. So campaigning with pamphlets and handbills and newspapers and mass rallies. We'll eventually get to elections that start using dirty tactics and look even more familiar to what we're used to today. But this one is starting to build the foundation upon which we've sort of stacked our own understanding of the electoral process. At this point, Jefferson and Aaron Burr were tied for presidential votes, and the House of Representatives had to decide. Alexander Hamilton chose Jefferson as the more stable choice. And I'm sure you're familiar with this story, so we won't necessarily go back into it, but this is one of the reasons that the famous duel happened later where Aaron Burr kills Alexander Hamilton. What happened here was that this is considered the first true peaceful transfer of power. George Washington had not attempted to run again in the previous election. So by him giving up his seat, that could very well be considered a peaceful transfer of power. But this is, the votes went differently, and a different person won the votes who was still running from the previous administration. So Adams was looking for a second term and did not win, essentially. And so this conceding that he did not win this election in 1800 is the more dramatic first peaceful transfer of power. Women in the age of passion, this politically tormented time, were also looking for their rights to be expanded. They were still concerned with the fact that the nation had gone through this revolution, had gone through all of these changes, but they felt that they were still being left out of these newfound freedoms. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote A Vindication on the Rights of Woman, and she has many different statements that she's making about the hypocrisy at high levels when men decided that freedom would only be for them and only some of them at that point as well, and questioning their assumption that women didn't have the right to reason, that they weren't able to have these political and philosophical discussions. You'll find her writing, part of her writing, on the assignment page, and I've highlighted certain passages that you might find interesting. So definitely check that out. One of the things that she was arguing for, and many other women were arguing for at this point, was that women should have the right to work and get an education, and that their education shouldn't necessarily only be in order to further educate their children, especially their male children, who would be political actors within the country. That they should have the right to work and get an education for their own benefit. And this is part of what is called the expanding sphere. So men had often had the purview of existing within the public sphere, meaning that they were able to make their own decisions in public. They were able to transact business with other people. They were legally responsible for themselves. They had the right to work. And women were asking to be a part of the public sphere and not just the domestic sphere. They were not wanting to be limited to the home only. Judith Sargent Murray is another famous female writer at this point, and she wrote On the Equality of the Sexes. And you will read that in your Voices of Freedom book for this week. And it was published in 1790, discussing equal educational opportunities and suggesting that women did indeed have equal aptitude for intellectual pursuits. suggesting that women should have access to education, again, for its own sake, rather than just to educate their male children. What should be noted is that women were counted as part of the population for electoral purposes, but could not vote or run for office. So they were indeed counted as one whole person rather than just 3/5, like they did with enslaved African people. But white women were counted within this population for the House of Representatives, and as well as the Electoral College. The 3/5 compromise had a hand in determining the first 15 to 16 elections. You have Southern slaveholders winning 3/4 of the first 16 elections. In 1800 was no exception to this particular rule. The South had an advantage based on a population that couldn't vote. So the enslaved African people, both men and women, and white women, all couldn't vote, but were counted to some degree for electoral purposes. So the actual voting population of white males in the South was relatively small, but they had a lot of power, federally speaking, because they were counting all these extra people. Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and other famous powerful men in politics at the highest levels at this point began calling for emancipation. And they weren't the first to start talking about this, but they were certainly some of the most influential who were discussing this at a high level. We talked about slave petitions before. Obviously, enslaved people were talking about emancipation because they were experiencing this firsthand, and they'd been discussing it essentially as soon as they were able to, before it was technically the United States. So slave petitions were unwelcome at this point at the federal level because enslaved people weren't considered part of, quote, the people, unquote. So this is the people that they were referencing within the Constitution and within the Declaration of Independence. But slave petitions were unwelcome at the federal level. Some states would still accept them. A few more examples of famous rebellions. The Haitian Revolution was influential to those living within the United States because white Americans began to fear that this sort of thing would happen within the United States and to them in particular. And what happened was in 1791, this was part of the French Empire. There was a slave uprising that ended in Haiti becoming an independent nation in 1804. This essentially reaffirmed the era's interest in liberty and inspired enslaved people within the United States to do the same. So if people had access to any outside information and they learned about the Haitian Revolution, they learned that Black people were able to establish their own independent nation. Many were inspired to attempt to do the same. And as we mentioned already, white Americans feared that this would happen, and in the southern states, white people were often still the minority population based on the number of enslaved people that they had on their large pieces of property. So they were fearful that they would be killed and that they would be ousted from power, and that essentially a free Black person's nation would be set up in its stead. Gabriel's rebellion was a rebellion of enslaved people in Virginia who attempted to secure their freedom in 1800. You see a drawing to the right here and a plaque that you could find in in Virginia to this day. Excuse me. And essentially what they hoped to do was to march on Richmond, Virginia, and to kill some and destroy some buildings and to take some people hostage, including James Monroe, who was the governor of Virginia at that point. And they wanted their own emancipation, and they thought if they did these things that they would get the federal government to agree to free them. Amazingly, it's rain that canceled this march. It was raining heavily, and they canceled the march, but word had already sort of gotten around, and people knew that this was about to happen. And Gabriel, as well as 25 others, were hanged in response to this. And sort of this extreme reaction to what had begun happening throughout the Haitian Revolution. And in response to this as well, not only were the actors or the potential actors hung, any slave in Virginia after 1806 had, if they were freed, had to leave Virginia or be resold into slavery. There is a documentary, it's about half an hour long, that covers Gabriel's rebellion, so please watch that. I will post it on the assignment page for you. You also have, at this point, an expansion of the territory of the United States. So we've talked about how it began creeping westward and sort of stopped at the Mississippi River at this point. The Louisiana Purchase basically doubled the size of what was in the United States. So in 1803, the purchase of $15 million, which is $250 million in today's money, which doesn't sound like a lot based on the amount of land that was purchased. You can see this pink part on the map here is what was gained from this purchase. One really important part of this purchase was the port of New Orleans, because this was an extremely important shipping hub for people. A lot of business came in and out of here, out of the West Indies, and it was essential to get that from the French. Napoleon needed money for his empire, so he sold this land to the United States. France had reacquired this land from Spain in 1800. You can see the green part on this map is still Spanish territory, in Florida as well. This is a double-edged sword here where it doubled the size of the United States with this purchase, and it also ended French presence on the continent. So many people think of Canada as being French because Quebec is still French influenced, but it was actually the British who were overseeing Canada at this point. And then Spain, as we talked about, was still present as well, but then it was the United States. And Jefferson had the idea that with this purchase of this large swath of land, that there would be an extreme expansion of the agrarian lifestyle. So the larger farms would keep moving further towards the west, and that this would not turn into a largely densely populated city-driven area, and that the cities would remain more on the eastern coast. Lewis and Clark famously went on an expedition to see if they could reach the Pacific Ocean at this point. And they were both Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, Virginia-born veterans of many different Indian wars. And their stated purpose, along with attempting to reach the Pacific Ocean, was that they would be going for scientific and commercial aims. So they were going to be looking at plants and animals and geography and what resources they could see along the way, both for scientific purposes and to see what was profitable. Over 2 years between 1804 and 1806, about 50 people left St. Louis to get to the Pacific Ocean. And famously, Sacagawea accompanied them, and she was a 15-year-old Shoshone woman, or girl, she was 15, who went with them as a sort of guide. She would lead them and help them navigate where they were going and communicate with native tribes that they met up with along the way. They crossed the Rockies in about 1805 into modern-day Oregon, and when they finally reached the coast, this proved that transcontinental travel from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast was possible. People weren't really sure if they would be able to cross all the way through. And this proved that it was indeed possible within the bounds of what they were hoping would be the United States. And what this did was begin to fuel this quest for manifest destiny, to have the United States reach from coast to coast. New Orleans, this popular shipping destination that we talked about as part of this Louisiana Purchase, already had an established culture. It had about 8,000 people in 1803 when the Louisiana Purchase took place, and about 3,000 slaves. There were free black men and women, and all the free people of African descent, as well as women and even enslaved people, had more rights in this area under French and Spanish rule. When the United States took over, those populations ended up needing to submit to the federal rule that was set up for the United States. So many of their rights were actually curtailed at this point. A treaty had promised that free people would have the same rights as citizens, but it didn't end up that way. There was this idea of community property in New Orleans, where women were allowed to become co-owners in marriage property. And this was sometimes also rescinded once the United States took over, as well as free blacks' rights in this area. So under French and Spanish rule, things were more equal between people, and then once the United States took over this area, it went with the rest of the United States. The Barbary Wars at this point were struck up in order to protect the commerce of the United States. It's the first U.S. war to protect commerce with Europe. Barbary states are, you can see kind of on this map here, northern Africa. And pirates in this area had been preying on shipping vessels and forcing Americans to pay cash for ransom. They'd also been kidnapping people and using what was called impressment to force people to serve in their own ships, in their own armed forces. The battle in Tripoli, Libya, was over shipping passage rights and an ability to travel in peace. So it kind of goes along with this not wanting to be kidnapped, not wanting all of your things to be stolen off your boat. You want to make money on those things, and that's why you're transporting them. For the U.S., this was the first encounter with the Islamic world. Of course, European nations had been trading and had a larger understanding of the Islamic world at this point because they're much closer. They butt up against Northern Africa. But the United States, those living within the United States, many of them had been born there at this point and had had no contact with the Islamic world. Native Americans at this point, with the expansion of the Louisiana Purchase and this doubling of the United States and laws still restricting the freedoms of Native Americans, what happened to many of them was that the United States attempted to push tribes into debt to make it so that they would need to sell their land to the United States, and white Americans would be able to move further out west. Farming was encouraged, and African American slavery was encouraged for Native Americans as well as part of this civilizing of the natives and helping them to assimilate into this new American culture, meaning a white American culture. We talked last week about how some of the leaders of the nation believed that Native Americans could be assimilated into white culture, while they believed that African Americans would not be able to be assimilated. So by offering them enslaved people to use to practice farming in the same way that white Americans were practicing farming, they were hoping that they would indeed achieve assimilation with Native Americans. In 1800, there were about 400,000 white Americans west of the Appalachian Mountains, outnumbering Native Americans, which led to some Native Americans believing that they did need to assimilate. The choices were move, assimilate, or fight. And many people didn't want to move, and many people were tired of fighting, so they chose to assimilate. There was a lot of tension that comes with this. Not everybody within the same tribe, within the same band, within the same location wanted to do the same thing. And there was tension between mixed race and native people, with the concern that culture would not be preserved. So with assimilation and intermarriage between Native Americans and European Americans, many were concerned that Native American culture would cease to be. Famously, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa were brothers from the Shawnee tribe, and Tecumseh thought that the revival of pan-Indianism or extermination were the only ways that this was going to end for them. So pan-Indianism, meaning all Native Americans joining together and fighting against European Americans, or fighting to at least maintain their own cultural differences. And obviously extermination of Native Americans was not preferable, although that's what happened to many people. Tenskwatawa, Tecumseh's brother, was a self-proclaimed prophet who thought that all whites were evil. And with these differing ideas about what people needed to do, often in times where there's a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety about what should be done next, violence is ready to break out at any moment, and battles broke out along the frontier. The War of 1812 was a two-front war, including with the Native Americans to the west, and to the north in Canada, and to the east, coming from the Atlantic, you have the British. So in 1812, Madison asked Congress to approve war. The British were supporting Tecumseh and still practicing impressment in trade ships, so still kidnapping people, and holding the crews for ransom and forcing them to fight for the British. There were a lot of divided opinions here. Many people did not want to go to war. They'd seen what war could do, and they knew that it was expensive. And many in the north, the northern United States, were against going to war again. Many in the south and in the west were actually in favor of going to war. So you can see this regional split making itself known not only in electoral politics, but also in how they should proceed with warfare. The U.S. nearly went bankrupt financing this war, and they were underprepared. The Canadian forces ended up repelling American forces, and the Canadian forces under British rule at that point. So this is a win for the Brits to the north. In 1814, so it's 2 years into the war, the British actually invaded the United States. They invaded U.S. ground, obviously, because they weren't flying planes at this point, so it's a ground war. They managed to burn down the White House and seized Washington, D.C. And it wasn't until December of 1814, under the Treaty of Ghent, that the war officially ended. And what it did was basically restore the status quo. No one really got anything out of this necessarily through this treaty. There was just a ceasefire. Notably, there was one more battle in New Orleans that was fought, and this was due to slow communication. So, following the official end to the war, there was another large and notable battle, which is quite interesting, obviously. We would think now, in these days, we would know immediately if something started or if it ended. Most of us would know by the end of the day, at the very least. At this point, there's no internet, obviously. There's not even a phone. You're coming before the telegram, before the telegraph. So there was no way to quickly give this information to people. What did happen that was important was that this war proved that America, the United States, could fight and not surrender their independence. They could they could physically stand up for themselves and say that they would not go back under British rule, that they would not submit to the West to Native American forces either. They were obviously not going to expand any further north because the Canadian forces had repelled them, but they did prove that within the boundaries that they were fighting for, that they were relatively solid at this point, even though they were pretty underprepared and out of money. There's a video that I'm going to post for you on the assignments page that you can watch, and it's one of those crash course videos by John Green that we've seen a couple of times this semester, and it explains the War of 1812 in a more compact way for you. So that's the end of Chapter 8, Securing the Republic, and for this week you are also supposed to read 3 different pieces from Voices of Freedom, like you are every week, and this would be Judith Sargent Murray on the equality of sexes, protest against the Alien and Sedition Acts, and Tecumseh on Indians and land. And next week, we will move on to the market revolution. So we'll be talking about this larger period of 1800 to 1840 and some of the inventions and improvements that the nation was making at this point. So please get your papers into me by Tuesday, and hopefully my voice will have recovered by this time we're making the Chapter 9 video for you.